So in the previous short video lecture, I talked about glyphosate or Roundup, an herbicide use increasing over time in the amount that's been applied to our crops in order to eliminate weed problems. Now I'd like to click the second most commonly used herbicide in the US, and that is atrazine. So I'm going to scroll down and find atrazine, and we're going to look at the aerial distribution and usage of atrazine over the same time frame. So I'm going to click on 1992, and it's going to show you the aerial distribution of atrazine. And it looks like this graph is different than that of glyphosate. We actually already had a good bit of use and application of atrazine even back in the 1990s. So let's skip through these years kind of quickly, and we'll see how the graphic changes over time. It appears to stay similar over time and doesn't have the increase like we saw with the glyphosate. If anything, it seems to be decreasing in usage throughout the United States. We're seeing less darkly shaded maroon colors. And here's the data representing estimated agricultural use for atrazine in 2015. So let's scroll up and compare 1992 to 2015. So they seem very similar. By the way, as you scroll down, this will depict the use by year per crop, and this is indicating that atrazine use has gone up and down a little bit but stayed somewhat steady. We use atrazine most often in corn crops. Another pesticide I like to review quickly is permethrin. This pesticide is one that has low toxicity to mammals and has low persistence in the environment. So let's look at how this pesticide use changed over time as we click through the timeline here. Again, notice that most of the pesticide use and application occurs in the Mississippi River watershed. And again, the usage of the permethrin is actually decreasing over time and not being used as much. That could be a good thing. However, permethrin is one of the lower toxicity pesticides to mammals and less persistent in the environment when compared to glyphosate and atrazine. So it's interesting that we've seen a decreased usage in a pesticide that has less ecological and human health impacts. The graphic below the map shows that there's been a steady decline in the use of permethrin over years, and the crops that it's used the most in has been corn. It's had increased usage in soybeans, but it's also most used in regards to vegetables and fruits. So again, this website is very useful in looking at numerous types of pesticides and herbicides and interpreting the usage of those pesticides and herbicides over time since the 1990s up through 2015. And the data is based on the U.S. Geological Survey's research that they've done as well. So please feel free to use this website to look into information further. Now, one of the herbicides that we talked about was atrazine, and it's a weed killer. And this is a map that was created by the USGS from data they collected on groundwater wells throughout the United States. This map depicts the atrazine in groundwater and the different concentration levels that has been found. Less than 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and greater than 75. And this pertains to areas that have less than 50% agricultural use, is the white shaded areas. So it's depicting shallow wells and where they have actually detected atrazine contamination in the groundwater. It makes sense that we're seeing a large portion of shallow groundwater being contaminated by atrazine in the Mississippi River watershed, because this color zone correlates well with the maps that I just showed you on the other website in reference to atrazine use across the United States. Also, this map is showing us the high frequency of atrazine detection in shallow groundwater beneath those areas of that are high agricultural areas in the Western Corn Belt, the Eastern Great Plains, and the Pacific Northwest, Eastern Washington, and the Mid-Atlantic regions, especially southeastern Pennsylvania, which we're familiar with is the Lancaster, farming belt region. So these areas represent relatively high atrazine use in hydrologic settings that favor the transport of the pesticide into the groundwater. This is a map of only one of many pesticides being used in the United States, and as stated earlier, the EPA regulates over 18,000 different pesticides. Atrazine is the second most widely used pesticide or herbicide, and it is running off of farm fields and getting into our streams and into our groundwater supplies. It begs the need for more research to be conducted on the other top 20 used pesticides and herbicides to determine their presence in our surface water and groundwater resources as well. So what are some alternative pest control methods that we can employ, or weed control methods, other than just using pesticides and herbicides? Well, one is ecological control. Ecological control focuses on controlling pests by manipulating natural factors without damaging the environment or the human health. It does depend on understanding the pest and its relationship with its host and the ecosystem. One thing to point out is that insects have complex life cycles, and each stage of the life cycle may be vulnerable to different abiotic factors, non-living components of their environment, or predators or parasites. So if we know points at which we can interject some form of ecological control in this insect life cycle, we can then battle the pest without having to use chemicals. There are 4 categories of ecological pest control, and they're listed on your screen: cultural control, natural enemies, genetic control, and natural chemical control. In terms of cultural control, non-chemical change of one or more of the environmental factors can actually cause the pest to find the area unsuitable, and they will leave or move away, or they may find that they can't access its target, and hence they leave and move away. An example of cultural control is let your grass grow to at least 3 inches high. If you cut your lawn too short, you're going to have weeds growing, because it's easy for them to grow in short grass. But if you leave your grass higher than 3 inches, the weeds won't grow. Also, avoid plants that attract pests. For example, rose bushes attract pests, and instead plant different types of plants that repel pests, like marigolds or chrysanthemums. Also, hedgerows, fence rows, and shelter belts provide refuge for pest predators like praying mantises, different types of insects. So even though those are helpful around a farm, they're also providing habitat for the pests, so you may need to adjust and remove those. Plowing or burning crop residue decreases disease, and if you mulch your garden, it also decreases weeds and prevents erosion. The second category, or control by natural enemies, falls into 4 types of natural enemies: predators, parasitoids, pathogens, and plant eaters. Predator beetles, for example, can prevent hemlock woolly aldehyde from killing hemlock trees. Mealybugs and caterpillars in Africa are controlled by parasitic wasps. And this is an example of a parasitic wasp right here. Green mussel, a fungus, controls desert locusts. Water hyacinth in African lakes is controlled by Brazilian weevils. There's over 30 weed species that are limited by insects. Natural enemies must control the target species without attacking desirable species, and this is part of understanding what's good and what's not good for the particular ecosystem. About 1% of the 50,000 plant-eating insect species are pests, and 99% of these are controlled by natural enemies. So there is a way in which we can decrease use of chemical pesticides and utilize natural enemies to help control the pests. So one way is to make sure you protect the natural enemies that already exist, and the first step in using natural enemies for control is to avoid or restrict broad-spectrum chemical insecticides that will kill the natural enemies. Hence, you need to stop applying the pesticides and herbicides in order for the natural enemies populations to recover so that they can feed on the pests. Another category here that we need to be aware of under natural enemies is to be very cautious about importing invasive species or alien species. Only do this as a last resort. Sometimes effective natural enemies are not always available, and sometimes we import pests but not their enemies. So natural enemies are typically found in the native region of where the pest has come from. So for example, the stink bug in the United States. The stink bug is not a native insect. It came over to the United States and was first found in Pennsylvania several years ago. But there's no natural enemy for the stink bug. So there's been consideration about finding the natural enemy in the stink bug's native territory and bringing it over here to help feed on the stink bug. And the stink bug is causing huge problems with our crops, especially our fruits and vegetables. So the deal with bringing another species from out of the country in to deal with an invasive pest is that we have to carefully test that other species before releasing it, so that we can make sure that it's not going to become a detriment to the ecosystem. The other category is genetic control. An example of this is where we modify the plants so that they're resistant to the herbicide that's being sprayed, and then the herbicide can be sprayed on the crop and not harm the crop, but only the weeds that we're trying to get rid of. So for example, genes for glyphosate resistance have been put into cotton, canola, soybeans, and corn. So these crops, cotton, canola, soybeans, and corn, have been genetically modified in order to be glyphosate resistant so that they're not harmed by the spraying of glyphosate for weed control, but only the weeds are harmed. Some issues with the genetic control is that some crops are not suitable to subsistence agriculture in developing countries because it takes more effort to grow these crops. The other thing against genetically modifieds is that they foster dependence on buying costly annual seeds as well as using specific chemical applications. There's concern that superweeds could develop that are resistant to the herbicides, and that these resistant genes are shared with closely related wild plants. So, I'm not quite sure if genetically modifieds are the true solution to controlling pests. But I will mention also that there's the Bt corn plants that have been developed. Bt plants have been modified with a Bt bacteria so that if a pest lands on the corn and tries to eat it, that pest consumes a little bit of the Bt bacteria and then it kills the pest itself. So not quite sure where we stand in regards to the success of the genetic modifieds. We've been doing genetic modifieds for a long time. This genetically modified biotechnology approach may reduce pesticide use, yet the unknown of the long-term ecological and human health effects continue to keep people skeptical with the widespread use of GMO crops. Another technique that can be employed is natural chemical control. An example is putting a chemical barrier out there by using a chemical that's produced by a plant that we want to protect that's not liked by the pest. As I mentioned earlier, chrysanthemums aren't fed upon by pests, so maybe there's some kind of oil spray we can make from chrysanthemums to spray around the crop area that will keep the pests away. There are many other options for natural chemical control, including pheromones, which attract certain pests, and then you can trap the pest because it's being attracted to the pheromone, and have them eat like a poison bait or something like that. Also, if you disperse the pheromone widely, it can confuse the males of that pest population and they can't find mates and reproduce. So that's another example. Other alternative pest control methods include IPM, or integrated pest management, and organic farming. I will talk more about these two in the next short video lecture.